of his remarks. So when you're looking at the full picture here, it does seem like, yes, maybe the Fed is actually considering that September timeline for that interest rate cut. And we've had, 3 consecutive months of, these rising unemployment rates, that idea that the labor market is continuing to cool. We still have, I think, about 3 inflation prints before we actually get into September. So time is on the Fed's side. If, Jay Powell is sitting here saying we need to see more data to actually make them more comfortable with that, I think it's very likely that the Fed may actually feel comfortable with that timeline if the data continues to follow this trend that we've been seeing.
Yeah, and we'll look to see what the CPI on Thursday, of course, tomorrow out of the US does in terms of underscoring that, or at least building on that picture, with core expected to come in month on month at around 0.2%. You would have thought that would align with expectations for September. We'll see what the data indeed comes through at. In terms of what we've been hearing from the US Treasury Secretary then, Jill, also giving testimony, what do we hear from Janet Yellen?
Yes, Janet Yellen just seemed to kind of reinforce some of those Powell comments. We heard a lot of similar sentiment from her about how the labor market is no longer driving inflation to the extent that we saw earlier in the pandemic recovery. So it does seem like from Janet Yellen, obviously Treasury Secretary, but remember, former Fed chair as well. She really, really understands a lot of these economic issues very, very well. She's really kind of playing along those same lines there. So I think you're hearing a lot of these, really important voices within the world of economics that, they are all seeing this trend toward this cooling labor market. And so I think that really does put us in a very different position than we were even just a few months ago, Tom.
OK, Jill Desus, thank you very much indeed in terms of the details coming through. With that testimony, of course, from Jay Powell and the Treasury Secretary, which continues for Jay Powell today. Jill, thank you. To the geopolitics now. NATO opening its summit in Washington by promising 5 long-range air defence systems for Ukraine. The fresh show of support comes even as the alliance resists offering Kieve a clear path towards membership.
The United States will make sure that when we export critical air defense interceptors, Ukraine goes to the front of the line. They will get this assistance before anyone else gets it. All told, Ukraine will receive hundreds of additional interceptors over the next year, helping protect Ukrainian cities against Russian missiles.
Right, for more on this, let's bring in Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta of the Opening Trade, of course, anchor on that show. Kriti, you've been following this for us. In terms of the support then for Ukraine coming through from NATO, how consequential is it? What is new? What is being repeated? What is the depth of support right now from NATO for Ukraine?
So the 5 long-range missile systems are very significant. And the reason here is because when we were going into the NATO summit, the added defense wasn't telegraphed. It was something that, of course, Ukraine was pushing for and Vladimir Zelensky was pushing for, but it wasn't something that was guaranteed or really getting the kind of endorsement you heard from Joe Biden prior to this NATO summit. What's important here as well is the types of defense systems that they're talking about. Of course, they've been on the hunt for those Patriot missiles, Patriot systems for a very long time. So 4 out of the 5 are those kind of systems. But the key here is that they are long-range missile systems. So the question here is not just defending against any attacks from Russia. And remember, in the last 24, 48 hours as well, you also had that deadly attack on the children's hospital as well in Kieve. So this follows the reaction or the international fallout to that as well. What's also significant is that now with these long-range missiles, Ukraine, with some countries' defense capabilities, has the ability to basically have a bigger offensive and actually have these missiles go into Russia as opposed to only have a defensive positioning.
Yeah, and of course there are caveats around to what extent they can use those in Russian territory. But that attack, as you say, leaving, I believe, at least 40 dead, that Russian attack on a children's hospital, really just underscoring the need for these defense systems. Meanwhile, Putin, who of course is ultimately responsible for those kind of attacks, has been meeting with leaders from all over the world and seems to be a little less isolated than he once was.
Viktor Orban, Narendra Modi, among many others, Xi Jinping as well, and not to mention his very vocal and very kind of almost parade-like meeting with Kim Jong-un over in North Korea as well. So you do see a lot of meetings in terms of kind of creating this axis of against NATO or axis even against specifically the United States. What that does to actually change the way that China operates, et cetera, hasn't really shown up yet outside of really pushing all of these various players saying we're on a peace initiative, we're looking for peace in Ukraine, because they're still trying not to alienate the United States and Western allies. Well, I think Turkey is a fabulous example of that, of doing just that, where they're trying to skirt the line of being a NATO member, but also working with China, being in that Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also potentially having a dialogue open with Russia. So you are going to see more and more of this, but it is concerning and has been a subject of concern at the NATO summit that Vladimir Putin, isolated for 2 years and counting, is now able to have these meetings.
Yeah, that Turkey dynamic is really fascinating, given, as you say, it's NATO membership, and interesting to see that picture of Modi giving literally a hug to Putin, and the focus for India on weapons and Russian oil. Right, Kriti Gupta, thank you very much indeed in terms of the latest on that NATO summit. Here's what else we'll be thinking about then today. 2:30 p.m. UK time, the BOE's Hugh Pill, the chief economist, will be speaking. There seems to be some consensus forming, at least getting to some kind of consensus, maybe moving towards a consensus that maybe August is in the cards for the BOE in terms of its first rate cut. So really interesting to hear from Hugh Pill later today. Meanwhile, 3 p.m. UK time, you're going to get further testimony from the Fed's chair, of course, Jay Powell. After what we heard yesterday, we'll see if he does get pushed on that time frame for rate cuts in a more kind of substantial way. At 6 p.m, meanwhile, UK time, there is a US 10-year bond auction. That's after an auction that came through yesterday, was well received by the markets. We'll see if that holds up later today with that 10-year bond auction in the US. Coming up, Volkswagen hitting the brakes. We take a look at why the German car giant is cutting its margin guidance. That is next. This is Bloomberg.